Have you ever stopped to think that that breaking news about Iran threatening Israel might not be just geopolitics? What if I told you that what's happening right now in the Middle East was prophesied thousands of years ago, with names, territories, and even alliances being formed at this very moment? That's right. Some people think the Bible is just an old history book, but the truth is, it's reading the news before it even hits the press. While experts debate diplomacy, treaties, and sanctions, there's another way of reading these events that most people overlook: the prophetic perspective. And you know what's even more curious? Most churches don't even talk about it. They're too busy with prosperity campaigns while the prophetic clock is speeding up. And no, this is not a conspiracy theory. It's the clear and direct revelation of Scripture, which already declared, in the last days, nations like Iran would rise against Israel, and everything would start to align. This video isn't for someone looking for just another piece of information. It's for those who thirst for revelation, for those who want to go deeper and understand what's really at stake. Here, you'll connect the dots and see how everything that's happening has a spiritual signature behind it, and more importantly, how it directly impacts your life. Because the end times are not the end. They're the beginning of a new reality, and you need to be ready. There's one detail most people miss. Iran didn't just show up in today's headlines by chance. This nation, which currently occupies the territory of ancient Persia, was already a key player in several pivotal chapters of Israel's history. You can almost picture the scene: Daniel being thrown into the lion's den, Esther confronting Haman in the palace, Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, all under Persian rule. It wasn't just politics, it was biblical prophecy unfolding right before their eyes. Now let's draw an important connection. Why did God use a nation like Iran, Persia, to intervene in Israel's destiny? The answer goes far beyond military strategies or government alliances. We're talking about a spiritual movement where God, in his sovereignty, chose to use even pagan kings like Cyrus to free his people. And that teaches us something profound. God can use even those who don't know him to fulfill his promises. And between us, if he did it back then, what can't he do now? This is where we start to see the cycle repeating. The same land that once served as an instrument of liberation is now a platform for threats of war against Israel. Does that seem like a coincidence? Not at all. In fact, it's the fulfillment of a prophetic timeline that was mapped out centuries ago. And if you think the connection between Iran, Israel, and the last days is over, just wait and see what comes next. If someone told you that Iran and Israel were once close partners, you might doubt it. But it's true. Before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iran maintained diplomatic, commercial, and even military relations with Israel. It was like that school friend who walked by your side, shared secrets, and then suddenly became your greatest adversary. The geopolitical scene that once seemed stable flipped completely upside down. And why does this matter to us when seen through the lens of biblical prophecy? Because the Word had already made it clear that in the last days, the alliances between nations would change. What was once friendship would become hostility. What looked like peace would give way to conflict. Iran, which once extended a hand to Israel, now raises missiles and shouts of hatred. It's as if biblical prophecy has become the front page of the news, literally. This abrupt shift in Iran's position wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Scripture says the nations would be stirred like a stormy sea before the final war. And if you think you've seen enough already, hold on. Because this transition from friend to enemy is just the beginning of an escalation that goes far beyond diplomatic relations. In the next topic, you'll understand what really awakened this spirit of war against Israel. When we talk about the Islamic Revolution of 1979, most people think of politics, protests, and regime change. But what few realize is that behind all of that was a massive spiritual movement. Iran ceased to be a secular nation and entered a new phase, a theocratic regime led by ayatollahs with a declared mission of opposing Israel. It wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a shift in the spiritual atmosphere over the nation. If we look with spiritual eyes, it becomes clear that the 1979 movement opened the door to an anti-Israel spirit, a spirit that fuels hate speech, sponsors conflict, and carries a constant desire to wipe the Jewish people off the face of the earth. And before anyone says this is some kind of conspiracy theory, just listen to the official speeches from the Iranian government over the past decades. Israel is called a cancer to be removed. Coincidence? Not when you understand what biblical prophecy already foretold. What's most astonishing is that while the world saw only a political uprising, heaven was already witnessing the fulfillment of yet another stage in the prophetic timeline of the last days. The regime change in Iran wasn't an isolated event. It was a trigger for the future alliances and wars to come. And speaking of war, in the next topic, we'll understand how Iran began to spread its influence, raising proxy armies to attack Israel from all sides. While many watch the news and assume that Israel's conflicts with groups like Hezbollah and Hamas are merely local issues, those who understand biblical prophecy see much more. Behind these proxy wars, Iran is pulling the strings like a master strategist. It funds, trains, and arms these groups with one goal in mind: to surround Israel with enemies and keep it in a constant state of tension and exhaustion. What's interesting is that the Bible had already warned us about this. The prophet Ezekiel described how in the last days, a coalition of nations and peoples would rise up against Israel. But notice, it wouldn't be just a single direct attack. It would be a gradual strategic siege from multiple fronts. And that's exactly what Iran is doing. It doesn't need to strike directly. All it has to do is fuel the conflicts around Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the list keeps growing. And here's a warning: if we're seeing these proxy wars increasing in intensity and frequency, it's a clear sign that we're heading towards something much bigger. The stage is being set. The pieces are being moved into place. And in the next topic, you'll see just how rapidly the prophetic clock is accelerating, almost desperately. When you see a series of attacks, retaliations, and threats between Iran and Israel on the news, you might think it's just another Middle East crisis. But don't be fooled. Every movement, every spark in this conflict is like a hand on the prophetic clock advancing toward the last days. Biblical prophecy, especially Ezekiel 38 and 39, isn't waiting to be fulfilled. It's already in motion. It's as if we're watching a full dress rehearsal of what's yet to come. Think about it. How many Iranian leaders have been assassinated? How many scientists, generals, and commanders have vanished under mysterious circumstances? On the other side, how often has Israel responded with precise bombings and cutting-edge intelligence? None of these events are isolated. They're all part of a much larger picture. And what's fascinating is this: the more intense the conflict becomes, the more Scripture seems to come alive, with color, detail, and perfect timing. We are living out chapters that were written long ago. This escalation isn't just about missiles and fighter jets. We're talking about spiritual movements manifesting through geopolitics. Iran, with its strategic position and influence over extremist groups, has multiplied tension points around Israel. It's as if an invisible web is being woven, and if your spiritual eyes are open, you'll see that this very web is described in detail throughout the prophetic texts. It's God's clock ticking right on time, without delay. Now stop and think. How should we position ourselves in the midst of all this? Here's a practical suggestion. Start following global events, not just through the eyes of a global citizen, but through the lens of someone who understands the Bible. Draw parallels between the news and scripture. Read Ezekiel 38 as you watch international developments unfold. You'll realize that time isn't just passing, it's converging. And the next move of this divine clock, trust me, will be even more revealing. It's true that Israel's Iron Dome system is a stunning technological achievement. It intercepts missiles mid-air, responds within seconds, and protects entire cities. But if all you see is the technology and forget the biblical prophecy, you're only seeing half the miracle. What keeps Israel standing isn't just sensors and radars, it's a promise made thousands of years ago by a God who never fails. And when he says he will preserve something, not even hell itself can stand in the way. Think about it. How can such a small country, surrounded by declared enemies, withstand so many wars, attacks, and attempts at destruction? It makes no human sense. But prophetically, it makes total sense. The Bible is full of stories where the unlikely wins, and Israel is the clearest modern example of that. Iran invests heavily in weapons, funds armed groups, builds strategies to encircle, but Israel is still there, breathing, resisting, prevailing. That has a name: divine faithfulness. And this faithfulness is not passive. It moves through history, manifests in every strategic decision, in every early warning that prevents major disasters. Have you heard how Israel often disables threats before they even happen? That's more than high-level intelligence. That's spiritual covering. Biblical prophecy says that in the last days, Israel would remain a target, but it would also remain protected. And we're witnessing that with our own eyes. Now, if you're thinking, but what does that have to do with me? I'll tell you everything, because the same hand that guards Israel is the hand that can guard your home, your family, your dreams. What's stopping you from trusting in that protection today? If you're looking for real safety, don't ignore the source of the promise. Look at Israel and realize that while missiles fly, God remains steady, and that steadiness is still going to be tested when the skies and seas begin to shake. Something new is happening, and those who only look at the ground are missing what's moving across the waters. Iran, which previously focused its attacks by land and air, is now taking action at sea. And this is not just another geopolitical detail. It's yet another line of biblical prophecy being drawn with precision. When ships are attacked in the Red Sea or the Mediterranean, an alarm should go off for those who know the scriptures. The theaters of war are expanding, just as Revelation describes. And the most striking part, Israel has already detected naval movements tied to militias backed by Iran, attacks on oil tankers, threats to trade routes, espionage in international waters. It's as if the sea has ceased to be neutral territory and has become yet another stage of tension. And once again, Iran is right at the center of it. This is much more than a strategic conflict. It's a prophetic activation. The waters, once silent, now carry invisible messages about the last days. Remember when Jesus spoke of signs in the sky, on the earth, and in the sea? That's it. Sometimes we think everything will happen only in Jerusalem with tanks and rockets. But God is showing us that prophetic signs are everywhere, and the waters, long overlooked for centuries, are returning to the spotlight. And more. Revelation speaks of dragons rising from the sea, global commerce being shaken, and intercontinental wars. Sounds familiar when you follow the recent developments in Iran and its maritime alliances. Now, for those who want to apply this practically, start paying attention to the details. News that once seemed irrelevant, like a stranded ship or a naval blockade, could be pieces of a prophetic puzzle. Subscribe to maritime security alerts, read about conflicts in the Strait of Hormuz, and try to understand how trade routes connect nations, because the sea, my friend, is no longer calm, and when the waters begin to stir, you know a storm is on the horizon. For decades, the conflict between Iran and Israel played out indirectly through proxy wars, sabotage, and isolated attacks. But now, the tone has changed. It's become darker, heavier. The question is no longer if, but when this direct war will begin. And what's truly impressive is not just the tension itself, but how closely everything aligns with what biblical prophecy announced about the last days. Nations forming coalitions, alliances being made, and the stage being set while the world remains unaware. Headlines scream, Israel prepares strike on Iran. Iran vows total retaliation, nuclear threats from both sides. But behind it all, a spiritual movement is underway. The war that's approaching isn't just between two countries, it's between two kingdoms. And this carries far deeper implications than a simple territorial dispute. The biblical prophecy of Gog and Magog is beginning to show signs that it's not as distant as we once thought. Time is compressing. If you think this is exaggerated, just look at what's happening in countries like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, all under Iran's direct influence and strategically positioned around Israel. It's like a chessboard where all the pieces are being placed into position. That's convergence. And when everything converges, politics, technology, ideology, and spirituality, war is no longer just a threat. It becomes fulfillment, a line that moves from the invisible into the natural. Now the question is, what should we do while all of this unfolds? First, stop treating these news stories as things happening over there. This war has everything to do with you. Invest time in studying serious eschatology. Books like The End of All Things by John Piper or Israel and the End Times Prophecies by Amir Sarfati. Understand the storyline. Because when you see the convergence, you realize the next chapter could begin at any moment, and that some prophecies are no longer future. They've become present. There's a chapter in the Bible that seems like it was written for our time. Ezekiel 38 and 39. There, God reveals a surprising scenario, a massive coalition of nations rising up against Israel in the last days. Among the names mentioned is Persia, today's Iran. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's scripture. Iran's role as a declared enemy of Israel is not accidental, it's prophetic. And it doesn't matter how many UN summits try to stop it. What's written will be fulfilled. When you observe how Iran aligns itself with nations like Russia and Turkey, which also appear in the prophecy as members of the Gog and Magog coalition, it's hard to ignore the connection. It's like watching puzzle pieces fall into place in a story where you already know the ending. Iran's hostility is not just ideological or military, it's spiritual. And no matter how much governments change, the spirit driving this opposition remains the same, a rebellion against God's chosen people. Think about it. Iran doesn't just wish for Israel's end. It invests billions to surround it, arm its enemies, and sow hatred wherever it can. This goes far beyond diplomacy. It's a field strategy. The coalition of Gog and Magog hasn't officially formed. But the ties, alliances, speeches, and agendas are all pointing in the same direction. It's like watching the trailer for a movie whose script was written thousands of years ago. Here's something practical. Study that text carefully. Get a Bible with biblical maps. Research who those nations are today. Watch documentaries that connect geopolitics and prophecy, like the videos by Joel Rosenberg or the Behold Israel channel. You'll be amazed to realize that Ezekiel's prophecy isn't some distant future. It's a lens for the present. And through it, we begin to understand the church's real role in this increasingly clear scenario. There are so many people in church today who know everything about soccer, politics, or soap operas, but almost nothing about the prophecies being fulfilled in real time. And that's serious. The Bible never called us to be spectators. It called us to be watchmen. When Iran rises against Israel, when alliances form, when war draws near, this is not a time for distraction, it's a time for positioning. And that starts with discernment. Because those who can't discern the times act outside of them. The church urgently needs to fall in love with biblical prophecy again, not as mere curiosity, but as preparation. Prayer needs to stop being just personal requests and become prophetic intercession. Real intercession. Prayer with spiritual geography, you know? Rise up to pray for Israel, for the fulfillment of God's plans, for the salvation of the peoples of the Middle East. You can start an intercessory group, study eschatological prophecy weekly, even fast with purpose. That's aligning with heaven. And this isn't about fear. It's about purpose. Because if God placed you in this time, it's because you have a role to fulfill. Maybe it's teaching children in your church about the last days. Maybe it's making videos that explain prophecy in simple language. Maybe it's raising offerings for missionaries working in sensitive regions. Whatever it is, wake up, because the battlefield isn't just physical, it's spiritual. And God's army needs to be alert, clean, and ready. And once you understand this, everything changes. Your life gains focus, your priorities shift, and your faith begins to operate with purpose. No longer just to make things work, but to fulfill an eternal plan. The clock is ticking, tension is in the air, Iran and Israel are in the headlines, but heaven is already moving. And in the midst of it all, there's a people who need to wake up. A people who carry light, but who need to stop sleeping. And maybe that light needs to start with you. Now that you understand the scenario, the question is simple. What will you do with this knowledge? Will you keep it to yourself as a mere curiosity, or will you turn it into action? Because knowing that Iran and Israel are fulfilling biblical prophecy is powerful. But even more powerful is when you align yourself with heaven and decide to become part of the plan, not just a spectator of unfolding events. How many times has God warned you, shown you signs, and yet you kept going as if it were just coincidence? Maybe it's time to stop ignoring the signs. Everything is right there. Wars, alliances, prophecies being fulfilled, and you still think it's too early to change your life? Let me ask you, are you prepared to live the last days with awareness and purpose? Or will you keep simply reacting to the chaos? The time for hiding is over. It's time to take a stand. Start praying, studying the scriptures, and talking about this with your family. Share this video with someone who needs to wake up. And of course, if you want to keep receiving content that reveals what's behind the headlines, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and walk with me on this prophetic journey. Because this is just the beginning.